right, why don't we get started? And before we start, I'm gonna apologize to folks up front. We are expecting some storms, and one of my dogs is very sensitive to these things, and he's already done a bit of whining. So if you hear that, please forgive me. He's okay. So we'll go ahead and start. I'd like everyone to just know that the session is being recorded. I think you all probably know that coming in, but I just wanted to double check, make sure folks are comfortable with that. I'm Nicole Poulin. I'm the Executive Director of the Family and Children's Trust. And we certainly thank you all, those of you sharing this coffee chat time with us. We thank you for being here, and for those of you who are watching this at a later time, we thank you for logging in. So I wanted to give a little bit of background about the Family and Children's Trust, just because we like to take every opportunity we have to do so. So FACT, or the Family and Children's Trust, was established in 1986. It was established in Virginia as the Children's Trust, which at that time there was a movement happening nationally where states were creating these independent trusts to support efforts to prevent child abuse and neglect. At that time, there really wasn't any municipal funding available for those efforts, so states created these kind of, unique ways of supporting that work. Virginia is oftentimes a little different than many other states, and so they created the Children's Trust to focus on family violence across the lifespan, and not just prevention. We are focused on prevention and treatment of family violence across the lifetime. So it's a pretty broad scope. And so I always like to say we are a small but mighty entity here in the Commonwealth. The structure for FACT is we're overseen by a board of trustees who are appointed by the governor, and the administrative support for FACT is provided by the Department of Social Services. So I am an employee of the Department of Social Services, as is Taylor Holy, who you will meet in a second. So historically, FACT funded a lot of direct service and training initiatives throughout Virginia. But in recent years, the board decided to take a more holistic approach to the issue of family violence, and really started learning more about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Effects study, and the issue of trauma and how that impacts folks throughout the lifespan, impacts societies, the multi-generational aspects of that. And so in doing so, they shifted their focus to fund more community-based projects. So currently, FACT funds supports financially 7 trauma-informed community networks, which are multidisciplinary networks established all around Virginia that are really focused on educating the public on issues related to trauma and ACEs, and also really focusing in on increasing trauma-informed responses within different systems in their communities. So FACT has been the only entity in the Commonwealth so far that has funded these community networks, and really provided a lot of support in lifting up that work. So in addition to that, FACT funds some different training initiatives around the Commonwealth, and also has really taken a deep dive and put a lot of effort and resources into really doing a good and thorough examination of the issue of family violence. And one of the ways that we've done that is really examining different data points. And so we developed several years ago the FACT Issue Brief series. Initially, that series was really focused on different components of family violence and really doing a really thorough analysis of the dynamics involved in those relationships. But in recent years, the board has decided to really focus on the issue of trauma-informed care and trauma itself. So we completed an issue brief series about 1.5 years ago on kind of practical applications for trauma-informed practices within different disciplines that work with individuals. And then currently, we're in the midst of a series that I'm super excited about. It's a series on really examining how systems of social injustice or systems of trauma impact trauma. There really isn't oftentimes a lot of work done on linking those two issues, the issues of kind of how societal forces and systems impact individuals and families. And so I'm really proud of the fact that the board has, expressed a lot of interest and put a lot of support behind this. So that brings us here today. So in the current series we're in on looking at systems of trauma, we've completed one on poverty and one on racism. And you can see those on our website, and we'll get those in the chat if they're not already there. And so today we are going to be discussing some of the points of our issue brief on sexism. So before we get started, I wanted to just let you know what we're going to ask folks to please mute yourselves when you're not speaking. And the structure for this coffee chat is going to be, we're going to have kind of an informal discussion about the brief. We have some of our committee members here. We have Taylor, who is really the expert who pulled together all of this massive amount of data and research for us. And so we're going to really just kind of have some conversation around this. Towards the end of the meeting, what I'd like folks to do is to put any questions or comments you have in the chat. And towards the end of the meeting, we'll make sure we try and get to as many of those as possible. I was going to leave about 15 or 20 minutes, depending on how many comments we have. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. We have provided some upfront questions, but we're going to just kind of see where this discussion takes us. So with us today, as I mentioned, we have Taylor Holy, who is our Senior Research Associate at FACT. Taylor is all things research for us and my partner in crime in the work that we do. As I said, we're a small but mighty entity. So we are 1.75 full-time employees. And so that's me and Taylor. So we are really, really lucky to have Taylor on board. We also have with us Dr. Linda Gilliam, and I don't know if she likes it when I call her doctor, but I love calling her doctor. And if I had a PhD, I would have everybody call me doctor all the time. She's been with FACT. She's in her second term on the board, and she is the chair of the Editorial Planning Committee, which is the committee responsible for oversight of the development of these briefs. And last, but certainly not least, is we're honored to have Nichelle Carver with us. She's the Associate Director of Housing. Homeless and Special Needs Housing, Nichelle, at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. Nichelle has been very supportive of FACT in all of our work. And before I start the questions, I did want to provide just a little bit of background about how these issue briefs are developed. We selected this topic really based on a survey that we did a few years ago, and we got feedback from folks all over the Commonwealth working in direct services that there was an interest in looking at these issues. And so we have the model that's been established is we have a multidisciplinary editorial and planning committee that has folks, engages with kind of experts around different topics, so that this is never a process that's done in a silo. It's a very collaborative process, which makes it, I think, really thorough and valuable. But it's, as those of you who have worked on these processes, it's not always the easiest thing. So that's why we are eternally grateful to have Linda Gilliam with us, kind of steering us through these meetings and this work. So with that, I'd like to start the questions. And I think the best way to do this is just to kind of maybe take one panelist at a time and get your response if you have any, and maybe we can just have some conversation about some of these topics. So the first question is, the brief focuses on some of the historical perspectives of systemic sexism. Why is it important to examine this perspective, and how does it relate to how things are today? Linda, would you like to start us?
I put my glasses on, so that was a cue for you. Okay. Thank you so very much. And I appreciate everybody who's taken the time out to come to this coffee chat. Why is it important to examine the perspective and how does it relate to how things are done today? I think that history is very important because it provides for us a backdrop to ascertain sometimes how and why things happen today. It also gives us a framework for discussions on issues factually, because some of the issues become a bit emotional, but having that historical perspective allows us to have those discussions factually to understand how those things evolved and how we've gotten to where we are today.
Excellent. Nichelle or Taylor, did either one of you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to, again, thank you for having me on this panel. Appreciate it. And thank you everyone for your time. I come from a social work perspective. I was a social worker who fell into government. And so how I see the historical perspectives being very important is because it helps to validate what folks are feeling and experiencing today. So not just that we have this information, but we also know when we're working with folks, when people are coming to us, that when they say, these are the things happening to me, you as a professional can go back and say, this is the history of it. What you're feeling is very real. And this is how we got to this point, to help educate people about what they're going through. Because as most of you may know, folks always think it's just them. And so you can talk about how it is not just this one person in front of you or their family, that there is a system involved in creating what they are experiencing.
I can piggyback off that also from a social work perspective, but more macro leaning. I think providing the historical context of these systems is incredibly important because, as the saying goes, like history repeats itself, and providing this historical backdrop, we can see how these systems are committing the same problems, but just in a new way. So it provides the ability to see maybe the more like overt ways of the past and compare those to the more covert hidden ways that they might be showing up today, and the overt ways that they're also still showing up today. So I think it's very important for us to know how these systems have interacted in the past in order to best combat them.
That's great. Yeah, I think, kind of the theme running through your responses is, that there is kind of reality associated with providing an accurate account of history that leads us to the current systems we're in today. And that really does validate, how folks are responding to things. We don't live in a vacuum, right? And so systems work pretty well to get us to do things that they're kind of sometimes established to get us to do. And sometimes, that's not necessarily the best response. So our next question is, this brief, as with the others published on systems of trauma, highlights the issue of intersectionality. What does intersectionality mean to you, and what is the importance of incorporating it in this brief on this topic? And I should say, with regard to this question, because it is incorporated in all of our briefs, but this is a point that we had particularly a lot of interesting discussion with this brief with the committee around, and kind of the different definitions and the origins of this word. Taylor, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I was actually pulling up the brief to see exactly how we talked about it in the brief itself, which I can also drop that in the chat for you all. And yeah, we, as a committee, we kind of talked about the difference between like academic level intersectionality versus like the way people experience their identities interacting on a daily basis. And we kind of settled a little bit on both of that into the brief, and talking about how people have acknowledged that their different identities and different perspectives have overlapped and create them as a whole person. Like they can't just piecemeal parts of themselves apart for a very long time. But then we also introduced the term intersectionality being coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and how that was a very important piece for acknowledging it in an academic way, or in that kind of sphere. So back to the question as to like why is this important incorporating into this topic? Like I said, people can't just take one piece of their identity of being a woman or not being a man and talk about how sexism impacts them, with not also talking about how their race plays into that, and their socioeconomic status plays into that, and their sexual orientation, and the list goes on and on, of all of their different pieces of their identity that play into how sexism impacts them throughout their entire life. And so I think that's why we felt it important as a committee, and I felt it really important as the writer, to include intersectionality throughout the brief, not just like make this a one-off segment of like, okay, here's how it affects, like here's the general part, but here's how it affects Black women. Like I didn't want that to continue to be a siloed part of the brief, but rather to interweave it without and make the call for additional research, because there's so many different complexities with these intersections that not all of them have the academic attention that they should. And so trying to do our best to talk about the intersections that we had available based off of data, but to call for more research to be done. Sorry, that was long-winded, but yeah.
Oh, that was a great response. Thanks. Linda or Nichelle, did you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I wanted to add, because Taylor really kind of nailed exactly what it is, but I also wanted to just say intersectionality also is how we show up to situations. And so when you think about all of the different intersections at play, and you think about family violence, you start to see kind of back to the historical ways of how families have been created and interpreted. And then you look at specific families based on race, or based on their socioeconomic status, and all those different things. You start to realize how violence plays into just the role in general, not even like an action happened and somebody acted violently, but how the entire situation is set up to be violent in some communities. And it's not that anybody's consciously thinking about it. It's just, this is the way that this community has decided women are relegated to certain duties and men have certain abilities to control them or own the families. And so we have to understand the intersectionality also with how people show up at families, at work, at church, all the different places they go, how their different identities are at play.
For me, intersectionality, just bottom line for me, is an interconnectedness that we all have, that systems of trauma, they don't discriminate. It doesn't matter your race, age, socioeconomic status, or your gender, how you identify. Systems of trauma impact all of us. So for me, it was that we are interconnected. It doesn't matter. Systems of trauma have an impact on all of us. So that intersectionality, the showing up, it shows up everywhere in society. So nobody is exempt. As quiet as it's kept, nobody is exempt from the systems of trauma in a family, in a community.
Thank you all for those answers. It's wonderful. I think intersectionality is also a really wonderful way of being as accurate as possible about talking about kind of the impact of systems on different folks. And so I think that that's, part of what you're all saying. But so often in this work, it's interesting to me that we kind of pit one group against another, as much as we feel that that's wrong. We do, racism versus poverty versus sexism is so often how we kind of view and talk about these issues. And, to Linda's point, like, it's all in one big giant mess and that we are all touched by it. And so I think it's wonderful that these briefs are able to kind of highlight that and keep that front and center. So our next question, this is my favorite question. What's the one thing you were surprised to learn about this topic as you work through this process? And y'all know I'm gonna have to share mine after you're done because that's how I am. So anyway, Linda, would you like to start?
It didn't take me long to think about that one. As I continue to work with Taylor and the other briefs that we've done in the past, what I've discovered is that the amount of systemic trauma impacts us all to some degree. If you have not been exposed to some things, you would think that it only impacts this family or it only impacts this group of people. But in reality, in working with this, and I'm so fortunate and humbled by being able to be a part of this, is you understand that it impacts everybody to some degree. So that's what I've learned in working with the briefs over the years.
That's great. Taylor, Nichelle, what were you surprised by? Maybe you weren't surprised by anything. I was surprised.
So I was surprised by some of my own biases, right? Like when we were putting the brief together, and I don't mind sharing because, the way that you grow is by, admitting the things that aren't so great within you. And so that section about when we use language like, why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't she leave? Whether I want to admit it or not, that's in the back of my mind sometimes. Like, why doesn't she leave? And the question should have really been, why is this person perpetuating violence against this woman? And it really made me think about all the things in society that feed into me believing that it is up to the woman to stop the violence against her. And it was important to me to really think about it, to sit with it and spend some time with it, but then to lift it up so that others remember we're not, whether we're in this field or not, we are not immune to having some of these thoughts that are part of the problem in the first place. So kind of like Linda said, it's all connected. We are not immune to being a part of this, whether it's perpetuating the violence, whether it's being a spectator, or whether it's experiencing it.
Thanks, Nichelle.
All
right, folks, I told you.
I can make mine kind of brief. I think I've looked at so much of this data and these things for so long. I don't remember what was new and what was surprising. But I think just overall in the process, what was kind of surprising is, when we had our first meeting, if you look at the topic of sexism, there's a million different directions that we could have gone. Like this brief easily could have been like 60 to 100 pages if we wanted to cover everything that it could have touched on, probably even longer. But I think it was surprising but good about how we were able to narrow down to specific areas that we wanted to focus on that we felt were really important, and make it into a cohesive document. So I think that's ultimately, it surprised me when I went back and reread it and I was like, oh, this actually does flow pretty well now that we have decided to focus on these areas. So yeah.
And I just want to say that this process of coming together and putting together an issue brief is not an easy one, because you have a committee that brings to the table diverse backgrounds. And oftentimes we get caught up in, as Nichelle said, our own baggage. And we have to sort through that in order to help Taylor have a direction to go. So we each bring some baggage into these issues. And so we have to sort through those and make sure that we are doing our best to educate the Commonwealth of Virginia on this particular issue.
Yeah, it is a bit of a painful process, particularly at the beginning. It feels, there's this feeling I kept saying to Taylor, this is normal, this is how it is, but it does feel like it's a bit overwhelming at the beginning. So something I did not know was that the maternal mortality rates have gone up significantly in recent years, which runs like against what I would have guessed, because, right, if you think about it, medicine has gotten, progresses every year. We know more about how to prevent certain illnesses and pregnancy related stuff. Well, evidently something's not working right, because a lot of women are dying in childbirth and shortly after in this country. And we know that this is particularly true for women of color. So I feel like it's interesting to me that as a society, we don't talk about that more, because it really seems like it's a pretty critical public health issue. So that certainly was interesting and surprising and disheartening. So our next question is, the brief examines several areas of society that are operating in ways that have or are causing harm to women on a larger societal level. One of those areas is media. What changes have you seen in media recently that work to combat sexism? Nichelle,
I'll take this question first.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to.
So when I saw that question, it was funny because I feel like some of the changes are very surface level in media, almost to help us believe the changes are happening. But then when you start to dig deep, so we have things like more women as anchors and leaders of news networks, et cetera. What we still have is women being asked to dress in a very specific way. If you look, it's not accidental that all the women who do weather are dressed in these dresses that kind of come above the knee. That's a consistent thing, because that's part of their dress code. That didn't change. Having a certain look hasn't changed. And also when you start to look at the subtle things, like if a woman has accomplished something, it's such and such's wife has done this big thing, and then you're like, oh, didn't know she was married to this man, but also why do we care? And so we still have these subtle things that attach women to their partners instead of themselves. And also, not to get all deep into the Will Smith thing, but it was that whole chivalry. He had to protect her, and the media kind of talked about it in such a way as she was a damsel in distress because she had this illness. That's the kind of thing that we have to really examine when we're looking at news stories, and not take it at face value, but look at, wait, why is it even being presented to us this way? And if you think about, not to get all deep into it, but most media companies are led by the same few people. So they control all the information we receive and how we receive it. And oddly enough, they're led by men. And so you have to understand how all these historical things feed into what we get in our media. I am so sorry, but that was one of those things I was like, ooh, that question, because media is not always great, just saying.
And media is not always fair. We have seen how if a white woman goes missing, the media just takes it and we see it every day, every minute on 24-hour news. But there's this inequality when it comes to women of color being missing and not getting the same amount of coverage in order to help families find their loved ones. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. And that's an example that I saw.
Yeah, something that you just said, Linda, ties into what I was thinking about. When it comes to this question, I was thinking about the different ways that media has changed overall in terms of not just like TV media, but like adding on like social media and those types of things. And that I think has created some ways for different creators that are impacted by sexism to share their stories in a way that's broader than before. Like before, if they wanted to go on TV, they had to go talk to somebody and someone said yes or no, versus now they can just upload a YouTube video. And there's also issues with like the algorithm and who gets to watch that and those types of things. So obviously it's not still completely fixed, but what you said, Linda, reminded me of the Gabby Petito case and how that was huge on TikTok, so large because of the way that she went missing and the domestic violence and the fact that she was a white woman, and it blew up everywhere all over TikTok. And then there's a lot of these creators of color who were like, okay, but this woman of color has been missing for years and nobody has talked about it. Like, let's get some traction on this case. And while I saw a few of them that kind of started to like expand a little bit, they also still kind of died out when people stopped caring. And so while I think that the expansion of media has done a lot in terms of what people are able to put out there and kind of express themselves in a way that isn't always overseen by like a large media company, like if think about like YouTube and those types of things too. But obviously it still comes with its problems, and sexism is still at play, as well as all of the other isms and phobias.
So y'all weren't very optimistic about media changing. You were accurate, but not optimistic. And I think that all of your points are obviously very valid and accurate. And that case wasn't just big on TikTok as somebody that isn't necessarily of that generation. It was big all over national news. And some of us who have worked kind of in the field of domestic and sexual violence for a long time were like, what is the deal with this? Why is this like every day in America, women go missing and are, horribly harmed and killed by their partners? And why is it? And it's hard to escape that it was a white woman, but it was also a young, white, very socially acceptable woman. There's virtually zero play or attention to all of the Native American indigenous women in this country that go missing every day. So yeah, there's definitely an enormous amount of inequality. I wonder if we could maybe touch on some of the changes. I know in my lifespan in media, there have been some positive changes. We see now just in commercials, right? You see a little more egalitarian, right? You have men doing laundry. You have women that are working more. Certainly there have been changes to that. I think that you have women that are allowed in certain media to have more traditionally masculine types of roles. I wonder if you all could speak to, if you've observed just in your lifespan, like any changes that you've seen in kind of, or maybe even understanding or processing that you've seen that have been more towards the egalitarian, or, just to kind of highlight some of that work as well. And maybe you haven't, but.
I have seen, my husband and I were just speaking about this not too long ago, just noticing commercials, for example. They are not like they used to be like, we have to make sure everybody understands this is a same-sex couple, like, and they put a whole lot into it. Now it's just like a regular family. And it's the one where there's a little girl eating her dinosaur or something or whatever, and she's growling and her mom says something to her. And it appears her other mom is in the background just washing dishes. And I love how that commercial doesn't make you think like, oh, look, it's two moms. It's just a kid not wanting to eat their dinner. Very normal kind of stuff. I've noticed those commercials happen more. I've noticed more interracial couples where the woman is Black and the man is white, because that is not normally an interracial couple that we would see. But I also notice more families doing positive things like loving on each other and hugging in commercials instead of the traditional father role. Like you said, women are leaving to go to work while the dad is still home. I think those things do have a play on our subconscious. Like we see that it becomes normalized. I wish it was more of that to combat the other parts that are so kind of, as Taylor said earlier, it's a little bit more covert. And so it's sneaking in there and we're having a battle in our heads that we don't even know is happening.
I think the ways that media has changed, kind of like I was talking about, in terms of there's a lot more avenues for media nowadays, which I think has been ultimately very helpful. Because if you think about like previously, like being like just flipping through channels and you had to watch whatever was on that channel and you could pick the channel, but like now we have so many options where we can seek out, like there's people that actively are seeking out media that is going against these stereotypes. And again, that doesn't negate the fact that there's a lot of still sexist media, but there's now a market for that where people are like, I'm going to sit and choose to watch this show that was directed and produced by a woman, and or like, yeah, and I'm going to choose to watch that over something else that might still express those sexist attitudes. And I think that has opened the door for a lot of different areas for people to kind of come through with their ideas that don't showcase that. And then there's also a lot of shows that have gotten remakes or like have been redone and have been a little less sexist in their previous rendition. Like I think of One Day at a Time, and now having like the daughter being queer and exploring that dynamic in their show. Media has definitely changed in the way that being able to pick what you watch on Netflix or Hulu or whatever, rather than just flipping through a channel, people have more agency as to like what they choose to watch, which feeds the market, I think. I don't know if that all made sense, but yeah.
And for me, I think that the media has given us it looks more like America. There are different types of families and they show the different types of families. It's not just the mom and dad family anymore. So I think media has changed there so that it's not foreign to us anymore to see two dads or two moms. It's not foreign to us anymore to see interracial couples. It's not foreign to us anymore to see some of the things that I didn't see growing up on television. So it becomes common, more accepting, let me say that, than we used to.
Thank you all. We have a comment. I'm going to circle back around to the comments and questions in just a few minutes. So keep them coming if you all have those you'd like to share. I wanted to see if there are kind of certain themes to pull out. So feel free to put those in the chat. So our next question is, based on the deep history of sexism within the medical field and what we know about generational trauma/health, do you think health disparities will ever be fully eradicated? If so, what steps do you think can get us there?
I wanted to take that one because I have a personal experience. I don't think it will be fully eradicated, but voices must be heard and people have to speak up. In my own experience, growing older and going to the same doctor, I noticed that she had a different tone with me. And of course, Nicole, I had to call her on that. I am not this little old woman who you need to call honey. No. So unless you speak up, they're going to just think that you're going to accept this. So I can imagine those persons going in to see the doctor for an annual checkup and being talked down to. No, you have to speak up and let people know that, you know what? No, you just need to focus on my health. Don't worry about anything else, but don't talk down to me, because that's not necessary in this day and age. And I will change doctors. So yeah, we have to speak up. We have to let them know. No, this isn't, for me, it was about age more than anything else, as she's seen me for a lot of years, but as I've grown older and, she is coming to me this way, I don't think so.
So that's really touching on also that intersectionality with ageism too, right? Which is a topic that we don't often talk about. And maybe we need to have an issue brief on it at some point, because it's really timely for a lot of folks. Thank you, Linda. Taylor, Nichelle, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do, because I have one where it's the difference between male and female, man and woman. My spouse and I went to the same doctor. We had this, and we'd had that doctor for like almost our entire marriage. What stands out with me, and why we had to switch, like Linda said, is I had a herniated disc. And mind you, that was my first time having it. Did not know that there's a pain that could be so bad. I can remember going and saying, something's wrong. I can't sleep. The pain is so big. And he was like, just take some Tylenol. And I was like, okay, but I've never felt anything like this. And it's starting to affect how I even drive. And it took about 7 months of me going back and forth and him finally doing an MRI and saying, oh, there's a herniated disc. So you have to imagine, I was in pain from November to May. The same doctor, when Frank went there and said, something's going on in my lower back, he had an MRI the next week. And I was like, wait a minute, you weren't even in the same pain. And what I realized was my pain wasn't seen the same. Like the fact that Frank said he had pain meant he was in trouble. And that's that stereotype. And it's very violent when you think of the level of pain a person is in for 7 months versus, and I'm not saying he needed to be in pain for 7 months. What I'm saying is I deserve the exact same treatment of, I'm hurt, send me somewhere in a week. And so I did say something like Linda said, I spoke up. And what he said is, well, Nichelle, you've had so many pains over the years. I just figured it was the same. Again, that's very traumatic to just say, well, you always are in pain, so let's just ignore this one. You're gonna have to treat it, because I might be a body that just is in pain. Like, it's just how it is. Never got any drugs, any narcotics or anything. Never even asked for it, because I'm allergic to most of them. But again, it was the situation of not even believing the pain because I was a woman presenting. And so again, and he was an older gentleman. He was very nice and kind, but underneath he had these biases that I have a hard time believing that these will ever be fully eradicated. I think we can do better with hiring more people of color, but I think we're still going to have the same issues.
So that was an example right out of the issue brief, the ignoring women, and particularly ignoring women of color in there, and all of the kind of systemic myths and perspectives that, we kind of swim in every day. So I'm sorry that happened to you, but it was a perfect example for this discussion. Taylor, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'll make this brief so we have time for other questions. But I mean, when I think of this question, I think of it kind of as a exercise in futuring and seeing like how are we able to imagine a future where these don't exist and what can we do to kind of get us there. And I think it's a very interesting kind of thought question, specifically when it relates to health, because of the ways that these problems are passed down generationally. Like I was talking to my wife about this last night with this question is like, if sexism went away tomorrow, like we snapped our fingers and it was gone, these health issues would still continue to be there because we know that certain people are more likely to have autoimmune diseases and like are more likely to experience like genetic issues. Yes, the intersection between disabilities and chronic pain. Yeah. Yeah, so like that's going to continue to get passed on through generations, regardless of if practices are shifting. And I think that's something with this question. I mean, I don't even really know the answer. I think it's a great thought question of, do we think we'll ever get there? It reminds me of the indigenous idea about 7 generations and how things that are happening are going to impact 7 generations like in the future, and how it probably will take about that amount of time. If again, snapped fingers and sexism was gone tomorrow, we would still have to be like 7 generations down the line before we would probably see anything sort of like any sort of health equity in terms of disease rates. So yeah, I just thought this question was cool.
I'm going to give credit where credit is due. That was actually Taylor's question, so it is cool. All right, we've got about 10 minutes and we've got 2 questions. And if we have time, I'd like to circle back around to a couple of the comments. As we continue to see economic disparities and the wealth gap widen, many individuals are focused on the gig economy. Those are the temporary contracts, starting your own business, you know, anything really outside the 9-to-5 job that offers benefits. What role do you think sexism plays in this shift? And are there ways that the gig economy alleviates some of the concerns brought up in the brief? What are some additional challenges? And I will say this is another one of Taylor's questions. It's another kind of thought question. So Taylor, you want to start us off on this question, this thought question?
Sure. Yeah, I can take it. I also want to make sure that we have time for any questions that you all have too. But yeah, I think this question, I think it brings up an interesting kind of intersection where there's a move towards more of a gig focused economy. People are taking on contract jobs. People are finding ways to work outside of a traditional 9-to-5, which is very rooted in how capitalism is not working for a lot of people, and people are having to find ways outside of that in order to literally survive and make sure they have a roof over their head. So I think sexism plays a role in this specifically because if someone, like talking about in the brief, needs more flexibility in order to work through childcare needs, or just like we were just talking about, if they have a lot of doctor's appointments because they're experiencing a lot of chronic health problems, and like Michelle said, you're having to go for multiple months to complain rather than just the one appointment, like needing that flexibility, I think drives certain people into this gig economy more so than others. Then challenges that then come with that, of course, is there's no like benefits, there's no guaranteed wages. You're like struggling to make sure that you have enough gig work to do in order to survive. So it's not it's not going to completely alleviate all of the problems that are being created within the 9-to-5. But I think it's something that people need to look at a little bit more complexly, because there's a lot of people that are like, oh, 9-to-5s are awful, join the gig economy. And then there's also like a lot of people that are like, the gig economy is absolutely terrible, and you shouldn't contribute to it or use that avenue. And I think we need to look at it through a lens that acknowledges who's being pushed into that gig economy, why they're being pushed into that economy, and get to the root, which in my opinion is overall capitalism and the way that that's functioning within our society, is pushing people that direction, but also not helping alleviate all their needs.
Linda or Michelle, did you have anything to add?
No, so that we can allow.
Okay. All right. So the last question is, the issue brief acknowledges the ways that systemic sexism impacts survivors of family violence by utilizing the socio-ecological model. The implications of practice section in the brief provides examples for direct service providers, and there's a lot to be done in the on the societal level. But what about the community level? What can folks do to decrease sexism within their communities, in their schools or neighborhoods or work environment?
I wanted to open up for a second to see if anybody had a question that maybe they were holding on to just in our last like 5 minutes. But if not, then obviously we can get to this question.
Yeah, we've had a couple of comments. I haven't seen any questions.
I just have a quick answer for that. I mean, very brief, not the end all be all, but I think the way that you do it on the societal level, I mean, on the community level, is not really community level, it's individual agency level is where the start has to happen. It needs to be an actual conversation, a commitment to lifting up the issues of sexism, lifting up the issues of family violence and how sexism plays into it, and then filtering it out. But I think all too often we think community level in our own house isn't right yet. And until we get our houses fixed, we really can't go out there and do the work. Not the way it needs to be done, because we're, still struggling inside. Not that you don't start, but you really have to fix what's inside. And I think about my team when we're talking about these subjects. Before I get them out in the communities, I need to make sure they are good within themselves.
Thanks, Michelle. Linda, did you have anything to add?
No, just want to get some time to the audience.
Okay. All right, I did want to add just to that last question. I think it's a critical piece is to think about people that are raising children and how you raise your children. And so if you have, sons or daughters or folks that are questioning or transgender, that you try and provide an environment that's open and honest with them, but that you set a level of expectation around how we treat one another. And I think that that's often a critical piece that we don't talk enough about is how do we raise our children? How are we raising our children? And that's really how we're going to impact generations to come.
And
so,
Nicole, I did have a last word, and because you reminded me of something, particularly in my culture, we have to be more aware and more accepting of people of differences, particularly when it comes to gender and identities. We're not forgiving in my community when it comes to identities. Also, mental illness. We're not there in my culture with understanding mental illness and calling it what it is, mental illness, and not letting it stay in a closet. So that I had to speak on that because and what we're doing, we're trying in the hardest place there is in the church, and we're trying really hard to get our people to see that there's a need to be more accepting of identities and understanding mental health.
that's a wonderful point, Linda, and I think that it's very relevant. But I also would point out that there's a lot of folks outside of your community, people in power, that are very excited to look at creating systems that are not at all tolerant to different groups. So we have all of 3 minutes. So I wanted to circle back around. There was one comment that one of our colleagues, Chad, put in that I thought was really interesting and fascinating. And Michelle, you agreed with him and his comment. This is with regard to media. So maybe Michelle, you could touch on this. His comment was, I feel like there are intersections. Oh no, that's another good comment, Chad. That was the intersections with folks with disability, which is an excellent comment. But with regard to media, more punitive, more vengeful demands in regards to consequences for people of color who perpetuate violence is kind of an observation comment. And Michelle, you agreed. I wonder if you could just speak on that for 1 minute.
Yeah, quickly, I agree, because we've had real life, we've had things we could see here in Virginia where a Black man perpetuated violence against a white woman, and good Lord, the capture was swift, the punishment was strong, but when it's the other way around, it typically doesn't happen that quickly. And the consequences don't seem to match what the consequences would have been if it was a Black man. So just, it feels like when a Black person does something wrong, the law is ready to do the heavy hand of the law, and really people of color, because Muslim individuals go through this too. Terrorism isn't just a Muslim community thing, but when a white individual has a terroristic act, January 6, 2021, we just don't have the same punishment. So.
And that,
And with the disability, I think also about the young teacher who had a mental breakdown and he was killed by police. And then there was another one in the Southwest, white gentleman in Southwest Virginia, who obviously had done some things, and he was captured without any harm done to him. So, and the two were the same. So I was thinking about Chad's talk about disabilities, and how even with disabilities, we're treated differently when we're different people of different color. So that's unfortunate. We need to move past that.
that's all just really good points. And I did want to circle back something Nichelle said, is it feels like, it doesn't just feel like it. All of the data and evidence backs all of this up. If you look at rates of disproportionate violence against different groups, the way it's portrayed in the media, I mean, it's all very factual and empirical. So folks aren't crazy, it's real. And I think that's part of that, kind of wraps us up at the end of our hour. That's kind of why we're doing this work. And my new thing that I keep saying, that Taylor's probably sick of hearing, is that the thing about fact that makes us unique, and one of the things that makes us so unique and really valuable to the Commonwealth, is that we are very dedicated and focused to providing complex understanding and solutions to complex problems. And so often in our society, we want simple answers to complex problems, and we know that those are not effective. So I want to thank everyone for our panelists. We did it. You all were magnificent. And for those of you who attended, thank you so much. We're going to share this recording on social media, right, Taylor? And so we invite you to share and have your colleagues watch. And we're always open for comments. If you want to email me or Taylor to learn more, please check out our website. And hopefully we'll be doing this more regularly. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.